The U.S. Army banned the device the moment it was discovered. Too dangerous, too unofficial, too far outside doctrine. So they never wrote it down. They never trained it. They never credited the man who built it. But in the spring of 1944, that banned idea flipped German scout cars onto their roofs, cut artillery strikes in half, and saved hundreds of lives, all without a single approved weapon. The U.S. Army banned the device the moment it was discovered. Too dangerous, too unofficial, too far outside doctrine. There was no manual entry for it, no training film, no after-action report that explained how it worked or who created it. Officially, it never existed, but in the spring of 1944, something strange happened along the Italian front. German reconnaissance units, highly effective, disciplined, and methodical, began to fail. Scout cars that had operated with near impunity for months suddenly stopped returning. Patrol routes changed. Speeds dropped. Crews dismounted to inspect roads that had never concerned them before. Within weeks, artillery strikes, based on reconnaissance reports, fell sharply. American casualty rates followed. On paper, the improvement was attributed to enhanced defensive awareness and better coordination, where, quote, those explanations were clean, acceptable, safe. They were also incomplete, because none of those official changes explain why German scout cars were flipping onto their roofs, intact, unmined, and undamaged by any approved American weapon. To understand what actually happened, you have to understand what German reconnaissance was doing to American units in early 1944. Scout cars weren't killing soldiers directly, they were identifying them. At dawn and dusk, light armored vehicles moved quickly along predictable roads skirting American lines. Their job was simple: observe, record, withdraw. They noted troop concentrations, weapon emplacements, supply dumps, command posts. 12 hours later, artillery arrived. By the time shells landed, the scout car was already gone, and the men who had been observed were already dead or wounded. From the American perspective, it felt random. From the German perspective, it was systematic, and it worked. The SD Kfz 222 was perfectly suited for this role. Fast enough to disengage, light enough to maneuver on narrow mountain roads, armored enough to shrug off rifle fire. American doctrine had answers for vehicles like it: bazookas, mines, anti-tank rifles. In reality, those tools were scarce, misallocated, or reserved for situations that rarely matched daily reconnaissance patrols. The gap between doctrine and reality grew wider every week. As German patrols continued, American infantry began to recognize the pattern. They weren't losing men in assaults. They were losing them in follow-on strikes that began with a scout car rolling past their positions, unchallenged. That recognition created frustration. Frustration became anger. Anger eventually turned into a question no one wanted to ask out loud. What happens when the approved solutions don't exist? For most soldiers, the answer was resignation. You wait. You follow orders. You hope resupply arrives before the next patrol does. But not everyone thinks that way. Some people see systems instead of rules. They notice repeating failures instead of isolated incidents. They stop asking what is allowed and start asking what actually works. One of those people was a corporal in the 34th Infantry Division. He didn't have authority. He didn't have engineering training. And he didn't have permission. What he had was a clear understanding of the problem. German scout cars were fast, predictable, and vulnerable in exactly one place: the wheels. Not the armor, not the crew, the axle line. If that vulnerability could be exploited at speed, the vehicle wouldn't need to be destroyed. It only needed to lose stability. The idea was simple enough to be dismissed immediately. Wire across a road sounded like a defensive obstacle, not an anti-vehicle weapon. It wasn't designed to stop armor, and, if placed incorrectly, it could injure friendly troops. So the army banned it the moment it appeared. That decision made sense on paper. What didn't make sense was what happened next. Despite the ban, scout cars began disappearing. Despite the lack of authorization, reconnaissance effectiveness dropped. Despite the absence of any new weapons, something was clearly interfering with German operations. No reports explained it. No citations named it. No officers took credit for it. And yet the results were visible to anyone who bothered to look closely. The truth was that a forbidden idea had already been tested quietly, illegally, and successfully by someone who couldn't afford to wait for approval anymore. If you stay with this story, you won't just see how that idea worked. You'll understand why it spread without orders, why it was denied despite clear evidence, and how a method the army refused to acknowledge reshaped an entire sector of the Italian campaign. The consequences of that gap between doctrine and reality showed up first in the casualty lists, not in dramatic assaults, not in failed offensives, but in small, repeated losses that looked insignificant on paper and devastating on the ground. German scout cars didn't linger. They didn't fight for territory. They appeared briefly, observed calmly, and disappeared before anyone could react. And then the artillery arrived. Private First Class Eddie Kowalski died on February 18th, 1944. The scout car rolled past his foxhole just after sunrise. Kowalski fired his M1 rifle instinctively. The vehicle didn't slow. The return fire came immediately. 3 machine gun rounds, chest and shoulder. He died where he fell. He was 20 years old, from Pittsburgh, a machinist's son who had enlisted with 3 friends and arrived in Italy together. 5 days later, it happened again. Sergeant Mike Brennan saw the vehicle first. He'd been in the unit long enough to recognize the sound, the engine note, the timing, the way the patrol never deviated from its route. He waited until it was close and threw a grenade from roughly 30 yards. The throw was good. The timing wasn't. The scout car accelerated. The grenade detonated behind it. The 20mm cannon answered. Brennan was killed instantly. He was 24, from Brooklyn, the one who taught new replacements how to read terrain and stay dry in the Italian mud. On March 4th, the pattern repeated for the 3rd time. Corporal Luis Vargas was caught moving between positions when the scout car appeared at dusk. The vehicle drove directly through the company area, firing as it went. There was no warning, no engagement window. Vargas tried to reach cover. He didn't make it. He was from El Paso, spoke Spanish more comfortably than English, always shared cigarettes, even when he had almost none left. By early March, the numbers stopped feeling abstract. 47 men lost in 6 weeks. Not to major battles, not to breakthroughs, but to reconnaissance vehicles that no one could legally stop. The losses affected morale in a specific way. Soldiers didn't feel overmatched. They felt helpless. The enemy wasn't stronger. The enemy was simply allowed to operate. Each patrol reinforced the same message. We see you. We will be back. The official response never changed. Maintain discipline. Conserve assets. Await resupply. Those words sounded reasonable in headquarters. On the front line, they sounded like surrender. For most men, anger had nowhere to go. They followed orders, dug deeper positions, and waited for the next patrol to appear. But one man kept thinking about the problem differently. He had watched every incident closely, not emotionally, systematically. He noticed the roads the scout cars favored, the times they appeared, the speed they maintained. Most importantly, he noticed what never changed. The vehicles never left the road. They never slowed down unless forced to, and they never protected their axles. That observation stayed with him. It wasn't a tactical insight. It was a mechanical one. If a moving system loses stability at speed, destruction doesn't require penetration. It only requires leverage. He had learned that long before the war. In the rail yards of Gary, Indiana, he'd seen heavy freight cars derail because of a single failed pin. He'd seen cable tension pull equipment apart when forces were applied at the wrong angle. Big systems didn't fail because of brute force. They failed because of small interruptions placed in exactly the wrong spot. The scout cars weren't immune to that logic. Their armor protected them from bullets. It didn't protect them from physics. When the corporal finally spoke up, the suggestion sounded absurd to everyone else. Wire wasn't an anti-tank weapon. Wire was something you used to slow infantry. Strung incorrectly, it could injure friendly soldiers. Placed carelessly, it could expose positions. The officers weren't wrong to reject it. They were wrong to assume the problem would solve itself. The rejection didn't end the idea. It only removed permission. As the patrols continued and the casualties mounted, the choice became unavoidable. Follow doctrine and watch the pattern repeat, or violate orders and try to break it. The corporal waited until the cost of inaction felt heavier than the risk of punishment. That moment came after 2 more men died in a single afternoon, killed by a scout car that passed unchallenged and called in fire hours later. That night, without orders and without telling anyone, he acted. What followed wasn't a heroic charge or a sudden breakthrough. It was a quiet decision made in the dark, based on experience, observation, and a willingness to accept consequences. And by the next morning, the problem that doctrine couldn't solve would collide with a solution the Army had explicitly banned. He waited until after midnight. By then, the firing had tapered off and the valley had settled into the uneasy quiet that never meant safety. Artillery still rumbled somewhere north of Casino, distant and constant, like weather that never cleared. The ground was cold enough to stiffen fingers. The mud clung to boots and refused to let go. The company was dug in along the Rapido River Valley, just south of Casino. German positions were visible on the ridgeline during daylight. At night, you could feel them. Instead, movement, engines, the occasional flare drifting down and dying before it touched the ground. The corporal moved alone. No permission, no backup, no witnesses. If he was discovered out here, there would be no warning shot. German patrols used the same roads. If they found him crouched in the open with wire and tools, the best outcome was capture. More likely, he would simply disappear into the dark. He carried what he needed in silence. A coil of barbed wire from the supply dump 30 feet. Old, rusted, still strong. 2 entrenching tools. Standard issue folding shovels every infantryman carried. Nothing else. He avoided the road at first, moving parallel to it through brush and low ground. He knew the patrol schedule well enough to know when the window opened, but not well enough to trust it completely. The Germans were disciplined, but not predictable down to the minute. He stopped when he reached a narrow stretch of road framed by 2 oak trees. It was the right place. From the American lines, visibility was good. Anyone watching from the ditch could see a vehicle approach. From the German side, the road curved slightly, limiting sight lines until the last moment. If something was placed here, it wouldn't be seen until it was already too late. He checked the ground first. The soil was soft but firm enough beneath the surface. Mud on top, resistance below. Good for anchoring. He drove the first shovel into the ground on the left shoulder of the road, angling it slightly back toward American positions. The blade sank several inches and stopped. Not enough. He used a rock to hammer it deeper. 6 inches, 10, 12. The shovel didn't move when he leaned his weight against it. The second shovel went in on the opposite side of the road. He paced the distance carefully, 18 feet across. He'd measured it before. He didn't rush. Everything about this depended on placement. Then came the wire. He wrapped one end around the handle of the first shovel. 3 tight loops, pulled hard enough to bite into rust and wood. His hands slipped at first. Rust scraped skin. He ignored it. He stretched the wire across the road slowly, keeping it from sagging. When it reached the other side, he stopped and adjusted the height. Not ankle level, not knee height. Exactly where a light armored car's front axle would pass, 14 inches off the ground. He had measured a damaged scout car weeks earlier, during a patrol that passed the wreck of one destroyed by artillery. The axle height varied slightly depending on load, but always within a narrow range. If the wire hit too low, the wheels would roll over it. Too high, and it would strike the hull and snap. It had to catch the axle. He wrapped the second end around the other shovel handle 3 loops again. He pulled the wire tight, then tighter. The shovels creaked, but held. He tested the tension by pulling back with his full weight. The wire hummed faintly when released. Too loose meant failure. Too tight meant breakage. He adjusted by inches until it felt right. The entire setup took just over 20 minutes. When he finished, he crouched in the ditch beside the road and watched it in silence. If a patrol came now, he would have to run and hope he wasn't seen. If an officer discovered it later, he would face charges. If it worked, fewer men might die. That was the calculation. He covered the wire lightly with mud, just enough to dull its outline in low light, not enough to add weight or weaken it. The shovels were already rusted and dirty. They looked like abandoned equipment, not a deliberate installation. Anyone would have to be looking directly at them to notice, and by the time they did, the vehicle would already be committed. He withdrew at 1:15 a.m., crawling back toward American lines the way he'd come. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. The waiting was worse than the work. He lay in his foxhole and stared into the dark, listening. Every engine sound tightened his chest. Every distant movement made him wonder if someone had already found the wire. He didn't sleep. Just before dawn, the fog rolled in thick and low, blanketing the valley. Visibility dropped to nothing beyond a few hundred yards. It was the same fog that had hidden scout cars dozens of times before. At 6 for Teatra A.M., he heard the engine. The sound was unmistakable, a German straight 6, steady, confident, unhurried. It came from the north, exactly as it always did. He raised himself slightly and looked toward the road. The vehicle emerged from the fog at a distance of roughly 600 yards. Gray paint, open commander's hatch. Routine patrol, no caution, no deviation. It was moving at moderate speed, around 15 miles an hour. Fast enough to clear danger zones quickly, slow enough to observe. The corporal didn't move. 400 yards. 300. The commander scanned with binoculars. Relax. The gunner traversed the 20mm lazily, as if this were just another morning pass. 200 yards. The vehicle accelerated slightly, likely trying to clear the area before visibility improved. 50 yards. The front wheels were clearly visible now, mud-caked and spinning. At 6 for Teoshu, the wire caught the front right axle. What happened next unfolded in fractions of a second. The wheel locked. The axle seized. The vehicle's momentum continued forward. At that speed, the locked wheel became a pivot point. The scout car didn't slow, it rotated. The nose dipped, the rear lifted, and the entire vehicle went vertical before gravity took over. It rolled once, then again, then a third time, metal tearing and mud flying. When it stopped, it was upside down in the road. The engine was still running. The sound of the crash carried farther than the engine ever had. Metal struck dirt. Glass shattered. Something heavy slammed against the road and stayed there. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then the engine kept running. The scout car lay upside down in the middle of the road, wheels spinning uselessly in the air. Smoke leaked from the engine compartment, thin at first, then thicker. Mud dripped slowly from the hull. Falling back to the ground, it had just torn apart. The corporal was already moving. He rose from the ditch and sprinted toward the wreck, rifle up, shouting for covering fire. His voice broke the stillness, and the rest of the company reacted instantly. American soldiers poured out of their positions along the line. Rifles snapped to shoulders. A machine gun opened up briefly toward the far end of the road, not because anyone had seen movement, but because doctrine demanded it. Better to suppress first and ask questions later. No return fire came. As the corporal reached the vehicle, he could see the crew. The commander had been thrown clear during the second roll. His body lay several yards from the wreck, twisted at an angle that required no medical confirmation. His neck was broken. He had never reached his weapon. The gunner was still inside the vehicle, pinned beneath part of the turret ring. He was unconscious, bleeding heavily from the head and shoulder. Alive, but badly hurt. The driver was the only one moving with intent. He crawled out through the shattered windshield frame, hands slipping in mud and oil. He was young, barely more than a boy. His helmet was gone, blonde hair matted with blood. When he saw the Americans, he froze. Then he raised his hands. There was no resistance left in him. The corporal reached him first, grabbed him by the collar, and dragged him clear of the wreck. He handed the prisoner off without a word and turned back toward the vehicle. That was when he saw the wire. It was wrapped tight around the front axle, exactly where he had placed it. The shovels had been torn from the ground and dragged nearly 20 feet down the road, handles splintered, blades bent, but the wire had held. Physics had done the rest. He didn't hesitate. He dropped to one knee, unwrapped the wire as fast as his hands would allow, coiling it tight despite the tension still locked into the metal. He shoved it into his pack, then kicked mud over the disturbed ground where the shovels had been. By the time anyone could focus on what had stopped the vehicle, there was nothing obvious left to find. 6 minutes later, Captain Morrison arrived. He walked the length of the wreck slowly, eyes scanning for what should have been there. A mine crater, blast marks, shrapnel damage, something that fit the manual. There was nothing. The hull was intact aside from the damage caused by the roll. No penetration marks, no explosive residue, just a light, armored car that had flipped itself onto its roof in the middle of a road it had driven dozens of times before. Morrison stopped in front of the corporal. "What happened?" he asked. The answer was carefully neutral. "It flipped, sir. Must have hit something in the road." "You ate?" Morrison didn't respond immediately. He circled the wreck again, slower this time. Scout cars didn't just flip. He knew that. Everyone there knew that. But a German vehicle had been neutralized. A prisoner had been taken, and no Americans were dead. There was nothing actionable to punish. "Document this," Morrison said finally. "Photographs, full report." "Our pieces?" "Yes, sir." "Well, it's not." By noon, everyone in the company understood that something about the official explanation didn't add up. Scout cars didn't flip on clean roads, and this one hadn't been fired on before it crashed. But no one talked. That afternoon, while the corporal cleaned his rifle near his position, a private sat down beside him. They had gone through basic together. They were from the same town. They had known each other before the war. "I saw wire in your pack," the private said quietly. "And shovels. Be dauntless, see." The corporal didn't look up. "You didn't see anything." End quote. There was a pause. "If I didn't," the private said, "would it work again? Is much tant oua?" "Yes." "Is not Texas? Can you show me?" End quote. That night, after dark, the corporal took him back to the road, a different stretch, same conditions, same measurements, 2 more shovels, 30 more feet of wire. This time, the private did the work himself. While the corporal watched, the height was right, the tension was right, the concealment was just enough. When they finished, neither of them said a word. By morning, 2 men knew the method. By the next night, 4 did. The idea didn't spread because it was ordered. It spread because it worked, and because every man in that sector understood the same unspoken truth. If the army wouldn't acknowledge what had just happened, the soldiers would quietly make sure it happened again. The second scout car hit the wire 6 days later, March 18th, just after first light. Private Jackson had set the line himself the night before on a dirt road leading toward San Pietro. He copied everything, exactly height, tension, concealment. He didn't ask permission. He didn't tell anyone outside his squad. When the engine noise came through the trees, the reaction along the American line was different this time. There was no panic, no shouted warnings, just quiet anticipation. The scout car entered the stretch of road at speed, confident, routine, unaware that anything had changed. Jackson watched the front wheels the same way the corporal had taught him. The wire caught. The result was almost identical. The front axle seized. The vehicle lurched violently to one side, clipped the embankment, and rolled hard enough to shatter the windshield and collapse part of the turret mount. It didn't flip completely, but it didn't matter. The car was disabled beyond immediate repair. The crew bailed out under fire and ran. By the time German infantry responded, the vehicle was abandoned and burning. Jackson removed the wire before anyone could investigate. 3 days later, another scout car struck a similar setup near the Garigliano River. This one didn't roll. Instead, it slammed to a halt so abruptly that the crew was injured by the impact alone. The transmission locked. The front suspension failed. The car sat in the road. Useless. The crew escaped. The vehicle didn't. By March 25th, German reconnaissance activity in the 34th Division sector had dropped by more than half. The change wasn't announced. It wasn't ordered. It was simply noticed. Scout cars still appeared, but not with the same confidence. They slowed down. They hesitated. They took longer routes and avoided stretches of road that had once been routine. From the American side, the effect was immediate. Artillery strikes based on reconnaissance reports declined sharply. Positions that had been shelled regularly went quiet. Men who had expected to die during the next patrol cycle were suddenly still alive. No one wrote this down. No one briefed it formally. It existed in the space between official doctrine and frontline reality, carried by whispered instructions and quiet demonstrations after dark. 2 shovels, wire at axle height, just enough tension. The Germans noticed something was wrong long before they understood what it was. Lieutenant Klaus Richter commanded a reconnaissance platoon in the casino sector. He had been running patrols since January and knew the roads as well as anyone on the front. In less than 3 weeks, 3 of his vehicles had been destroyed or disabled under circumstances that made no sense. No mines, no visible damage, no evidence of new American weapons. On March 27th, Richter personally inspected the wreckage of the most recent loss, SDKFZ 222, vehicle number 237. The damage pattern was wrong. The hull was intact. The armor showed no penetrations, but the front axle was bent, and there were scrape marks along the wheel housing. Something thin had caught it. Something strong. Richter crawled underneath the wreck and found it. A fragment of rusted barbed wire embedded near the axle line. It wasn't enough to prove anything on its own. Barbed wire existed everywhere. Both sides used it. But the placement was too precise to be accidental. He reported his findings to Division Intelligence. The response was skepticism. Wire couldn't stop a light armored car. The momentum was too great. The physics didn't support it. Richter insisted. 3 losses. Same pattern. Same result. German intelligence began asking questions. Captured American soldiers were interrogated. None mentioned trip wires. No documents referenced the method. No training materials existed. But the losses continued. By early April, German reconnaissance units operating near Casino received new standing orders. Scout cars were to slow before entering narrow roads. Commanders were to dismount and inspect suspicious stretches. Routes were to be varied whenever possible. The change cut effectiveness immediately. Patrols took longer. Observation windows shrank. The speed that had protected them was gone. On the American side, no one knew exactly why the Germans had become cautious. They only knew the pressure had eased. Casualties from reconnaissance-triggered artillery dropped to almost nothing. And still, officially, nothing had changed. The method remained unauthorized. The reports that mentioned it were rejected. The success was attributed to vague improvements and good fortune. Captain Morrison understood the situation the moment he saw the numbers. Before the wire, 47 men lost in February. After it spread, 12 in March, 3 in April. The correlation was impossible to ignore. He faced the same choice the corporal had faced weeks earlier: enforce doctrine and shut it down, or allow something that worked to continue quietly. Morrison chose silence. He documented the setups privately. He tracked results. He asked no questions he didn't want answered. And when higher headquarters eventually noticed the pattern and sent investigators forward, they found what they were looking for within days. Wire stretched across roads. Axle height. Simple. Effective. The response from above was careful. No approval. No reprimand. No formal acknowledgement. Just a blind eye. Because admitting the truth meant admitting that a forbidden idea built by enlisted men with no authority had solved a problem official doctrine could not. And by then, the damage had already been done. German reconnaissance in the sector was broken, and the method responsible for it had spread too far to be erased. The method stopped being invisible on April 3rd, 1944. Captain Morrison was walking the company sector that afternoon, checking positions the way he always did, quietly, without ceremony. He wasn't looking for innovation. He was looking for discipline problems, uncovered flanks, poorly dug fighting holes, anything that could get men killed. That was when he saw Private Williams on a logging road near the rear of the line. Williams froze when he realized he wasn't alone. 2 shovels, barbed wire, axle height. There was no ambiguity. Morrison stood there for a long moment without speaking. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for his notebook. He crouched, tested the tension himself, and looked down the road in both directions. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. Williams didn't answer. "That's an order," Morrison said. The private swallowed. "Corporal Dalton, sir, is did for." Morrison nodded once. He already knew the name. He asked Williams to demonstrate the setup from start to finish, where to place the shovels, how deep to drive them, how to measure the height without a ruler, how tight was too tight, how loose meant failure. Morrison took notes while he watched. Not doctrine notes, practical ones. "How many have you set?" Morrison asked. "4, sir." In quote. "Results?" "I want to." 1 hit. Scout car flipped. Crew captured. Would not Weiss. Morrison closed the notebook and stood up. He knew exactly what this meant. The field manual didn't authorize the method. He had explicitly ordered Dalton not to pursue improvised anti-vehicle measures. And yet, here it was, working, repeatable, and saving lives. "Show me 2 more setups before dark," Morrison said. "Different terrain." "Hour." Williams blinked. "Sir?" Braxis. "That's an order." With his interest. By April 10th, Morrison had documented 17 wire installations across the company's sector. He interviewed every soldier involved, recorded locations, angles, concealment methods, tracked results. The numbers were consistent. 87% of scout cars that struck the wire were disabled or destroyed. 0 friendly casualties attributable to the installations. Material cost: 30 feet of barbed wire and 2 shovels, equipment already issued. He compiled the data into a 3-page report. Technical specifications, tactical recommendations, statistical validation. On April 12th, he sent it to battalion headquarters. The response came back on April 19th. Method unauthorized. Discontinue immediately. Violates field manual regulations regarding obstacle placement. Fails to meet engineering safety standards. Morrison read it twice. Then he filed the response and changed nothing. The wire stayed up. The casualty rate stayed down. And officially, nothing was happening. But numbers have a way of forcing attention. In February 1944, before the wire method spread, the 34th Infantry Division lost 47 men to reconnaissance-related attacks. In March, the number dropped to 12. In April, it dropped to 3. Reconnaissance vehicle sightings told the same story. February 147, March 89, April 34. Artillery strikes called in by German reconnaissance followed the same decline. Someone at division level noticed. Colonel Anderson, the division intelligence officer, pulled the casualty reports and overlaid them with patrol activity. The pattern was unmistakable. The improvement wasn't gradual. It wasn't tied to resupply schedules. It appeared suddenly and remained stable. He sent investigators forward in late April. They found the wire within 2 days. Axle height installations across roads and trails, concealed, consistent, effective. Anderson understood the problem immediately. He could not officially approve a method that violated doctrine, but he could not deny results that were saving lives. His solution was administrative silence. No orders to stop. No orders to continue. Just a memo that went nowhere and a blind eye turned toward the front. In May 1944, the 34th Infantry Division was pulled off the line for rest and refit. Dalton's company was sent to a rear area near Naples. Real beds, hot food, no scout cars. On May 23rd, Dalton was ordered to report to division headquarters. He expected punishment. He arrived in his cleanest uniform, which still carried the marks of weeks in the field, mud stains that never fully came out, boots worn thin at the soles. Colonel Anderson met him in a canvas-walled office. "I've read the reports about your wire method," Anderson said. Dalton started to speak, then stopped. "I'm not here to court-martial you," Anderson continued. "I'm here to ask you to teach it." And Dalton didn't answer right away. Anderson explained that the 36th Infantry Division was rotating into the sector, for 34th was leaving. They would face the same reconnaissance problem within days. The official anti-tank school took weeks and required equipment that still didn't exist in sufficient numbers. Dalton's method took one night and materials from the supply dump. "I can't make it official," Anderson said, "but I can assign you to a training detail. This discage, the paperwork called it improvised obstacle placement. One floor. Nobody needed to know what that actually meant." For 2 weeks in June 1944, Dalton trained 60 soldiers. He showed them photographs of wrecked scout cars, walked them through placement and tension, explained concealment and removal. Most were skeptical until they saw the results. By July, the method had spread to 3 divisions. By August, it was being used across the Italian front. Never written into manuals, never officially credited, just knowledge passed quietly from soldier to soldier. By the end of the summer of 1944, the method no longer belonged to any single unit. It had moved the way unofficial knowledge always moves in wartime, quietly, unevenly, and without paperwork. Soldiers carried it with them when they rotated sectors. NCOs passed it along during night briefings. Scout and sniper teams adapted it to new terrain without ever writing a line down. There was no single moment when it became widespread. It simply stopped being rare. Conservative estimates compiled after the campaign credited axle height wire obstacles with disabling or destroying more than 40 German reconnaissance vehicles between March and August of 1944. Most were SD, Kfz, 222 seconds, though several half-tracks were also damaged badly enough to be abandoned. Each vehicle lost meant something larger than metal and manpower. It meant fewer accurate maps of American positions, fewer artillery fire missions called in hours later, fewer delayed casualties that never made the headlines. Division staff tried to quantify the effect, but the numbers never told the full story. What mattered most was what stopped happening. Entire platoons stopped being wiped out by shelling that followed predictable reconnaissance runs. Positions that had once been evacuated every few days remained occupied for weeks. Soldiers began sleeping through dawn without waiting for the sound of engines. The pressure eased. Officially, the improvement was attributed to changing conditions, improved coordination, better camouflage, increased experience. Those explanations were safe. They also avoided a problem the Army didn't want to confront. A corporal had identified a systemic weakness, acted without permission, and solved it faster than the institution built to do exactly that. There was no appetite to celebrate that. Admitting the truth would have raised uncomfortable questions about doctrine, authority, and how innovation actually occurs under fire. It was easier to let the results speak quietly and move on. After Italy, the war moved north and then outward. New fronts opened. New problems replaced old ones. Dalton never followed the method again. He wasn't promoted for it. He wasn't disciplined for it either. When the war ended in Europe, he was discharged in November 1945 with the rank of sergeant. His paperwork listed his assignments, his campaigns, and a combat infantryman badge. There was no mention of wire, no mention of scout cars, no mention of lives saved. He returned to Gary, Indiana. U.S. Steel hired him as a switchman in January 1946. The rail yards were unchanged. Same couplers, same cables, same small failures, waiting to become disasters if someone didn't notice them in time. Dalton married a woman named Dorothy from East Chicago. They had 3 children. He worked the yards for more than 4 decades. He didn't talk about Italy. When asked, He said he did his job and came home. Once a year, around mid-March, his phone would ring. Old voices on the other end, men who remembered the fog, the road, and the sound of a vehicle flipping where it wasn't supposed to. They talked for a few minutes, then they hung up. That was it. In 1963, a military historian studying German reconnaissance losses in Italy noticed something unusual. Records showed a sharp increase in vehicle rollovers in early 1944, concentrated in a specific sector around Cassino. The pattern didn't match terrain, it didn't match weather, and it didn't match known Allied tactics. The historian began interviewing veterans. Eventually, the name Dalton came up. Dalton agreed to a single interview. He explained the method in plain terms: placement, height, tension, concealment, dates, locations. Then he asked for one thing in return: don't use my name. The historian honored the request. The article, published in 1,965 inches, the Journal of Military History, credited the innovation to unidentified non-commissioned officers in the 34th Infantry Division. There. That was close enough. Dalton died in 1987, age 63, of a heart attack in his living room. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II and his 41 years at U.S. Steel. It didn't mention wire. It didn't mention scout cars. It didn't mention Italy. Dorothy knew he had done something important during the war. She never knew exactly what. The method outlived him. Post-war analysis by Army engineers validated the concept. By 1949, axle height wire obstacles were integrated into official doctrine as an approved method for disabling light reconnaissance vehicles. The manuals cited field observations from the Italian campaign, with their tenster, no names. Modern military forces still teach variations of the technique today. The principle hasn't changed. Vehicles depend on stability. Disrupt it at speed, and armor becomes irrelevant. What changed was how the Army chose to remember it. The official version credits process, committees, and gradual improvement. The real version began with a corporal who couldn't watch the same mistake kill his friends again, took 2 shovels and a length of wire, and accepted the risk of punishment to force a system to fail. That truth never made it into the manuals, but the results did.